Prior to 1920 and into that decade, barnstorming was a national sport. Pilots would take their little planes and they would fly to some big farm field. They'd land, they'd make a deal with the farmer. He would house their plane in their barn. He would offer them the use of his field, call in his neighbors and friends and members of the town and community. The pilot would put on a show, share the proceeds with the farmer, and then move on to the next town. There were a few women to do this, and one of these early women was also a person who tried to break limits, tried to see how fast she could go, how high she could fly, how far she could fly. So in preparation for one of her latest challenges, Ruth Law went tenting. She went tenting on the top of a hotel in Chicago in the middle of November to get herself ready for this flight that she was going to make. She was going to fly farther than anyone ever had on one tank of gas. It was November. It was Chicago, and it was cold. She woke up the morning of her flight, and she got dressed in 2 woolen suits, 2 leather jackets, and of course, her skirt. Ruth Law was not a suffragist. She may be challenging men in a male-dominated activity, but she was going to dress properly for it. She was going to fly from Chicago to New York City with 1 stop in between for gas. She had what I would call a chair in the air. Imagine it was a bi-wing, 2 wings. In the middle of these wings was a seat, a chair. Behind the chair were the gas tanks. Behind the gas tanks was the motor. Behind the motor was the propeller out to the back. In front of her was a place for her feet and the control. She'd gotten this plane from Orville Wright. She had tried to buy a better plane, an enclosed plane, from Glenn Curtis, but Glenn Curtis said, no, 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 no. A woman could not handle this heavier plane. And so this plane, which she called Baby, a plane which she had done loop-the-loops in, a plane which she had flown at night, first woman to do either of those things, this was going to be the plane that she was going to fly from Chicago to New York in November. When she got down to the plan was to take off at about 7:30. It was so cold the motor would not start. Her mechanics were working on it. There was no place to put a map. So in her pocket, she had a speedometer, she had a compass, and she had a clock. On the cuff of her sleeve, she had written the longitude and latitude of the places she would fly over. This gave rise to the term flying off the cuff. She also had ingeniously created a box, and in this box she had 2 rollers. And she had taken the street maps, or the road maps, from Chicago to New York, cut out the parts that pertained to her trip, and put them on the roller and strapped them to her leg. This was how she would navigate. After an hour's wait, she couldn't wait any longer. The motor was going, but the winds had picked up, and her mechanics did not want her to go. She said she had to. She was losing sunlight. She got in the plane and started to take off, and that wind buffeted her so that the wings almost hit the ground. Her mechanics cried. They were so sure they were never going to see her again. She took off and went up about 100 feet. Let me amend that. A mile. She went up a mile and traveled at 100 miles an hour and started east, a little southeast. The wind was coming right out. It was blowing the goggles into her face. Her mechanics had given her an extra gas tank, so she had 55 gallons altogether. These 2 tanks made the plane so heavy that they had to take the lights off so she could now not fly at night. And they had given her 1 windshield in front of her feet. 2 miles outside of Hornell, where she's supposed to land to refuel. There's no more gas. The plane has just run out of gas. And so she's got to glide this thing the final 2 miles and land in Hornell. People run out onto the field. They're so happy. They ran out before she even landed. And she didn't have much control, so accidents were averted that day. When she landed, she stood up, very stiff, very cold, but the first thing she did was retrieve her skirt. She had taken it off before she sat down, stuffed it behind the seat. Now she had to put it on before she greeted the crowd. They helped her to the car. She went into a restaurant, and it is recorded that she had eggs and coffee. Went back to her plane, which had been duly fueled, and took off again. The plan was now to make New York City, but she had lost so much time in the morning, and then she lost a little time eating her eggs, that she only got as far as Binghamton. The flight from Chicago to Hornell was 590 miles, the longest distance anyone had flown up to this point. She landed in Binghamton. Unscheduled stop, put her skirt on, tied her plane to a tree, and asked, "Can anyone put me up for the night?" Of course, there were many takers for that. The next morning, she got to New York City. Governor's Island was where she was going to land, and again, this time she banked the plane to get enough gasoline into the motor to land the plane. It was bone dry when she landed. She had done it. She told the newspapers, "I didn't do this for any monetary recompense. I just did it for the pure joy of the challenge." But now this woman could command $900 a week, unheard of for a woman to earn that kind of money. After World War I, she and her husband put together a flying circus, and they went around the world. Finally, they got planes from Glenn Curtiss, planes that actually you could get into, and took this show on the road or on the air. Thrilled audiences all over. Transferred from plane to plane in the air, transferred from car to plane in motion, transferred, stood on top of the plane, and also would race cars. By 1922, her husband was so nervous that something was going to happen to her that he called the newspapers together and said, "My wife is going to retire." And she found out about it by reading the newspaper. But she loved her husband, and she also said, "You know, this sport is getting too tame. There's too many regulations." And so Ruth Law did what the newspaper said she was going to do. She retired in 1922. And the woman lived to the 1970s. Ruth Law was a pioneer in her field and an outstanding female pilot.